joining the session, or if you were in the previous session, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that little break. We got to see a really powerful, impactful game being played there. So thank you so much again to Anthony Default. And yeah, just thank you for bearing with us in these times of technical difficulties. But that's part and parcel of the entire virtual experience. As promised, we have some more talks for you, starting off with Naomi Assambili, a clinician and games developer, here to talk about her journey of building games to improve the mental health of marginalized young people. Floor's all yours. Take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. It's great to be here, and it's been great to listen to some of the talks this morning. My name's Naomi Assambili, and I guess within this short space of time that I have with you, what I wanted to do was set a bit of a provocation, but also give a little bit of a background to some of the work that we've been doing around mental health, games and children and young people. So I'm going to do a bit of a screen share with presentation. And just to give a little bit of background to who I am, I run an organisation called Chinua. So we're a healthcare innovation organisation focusing on creating solutions to improve health, and mainly mental health, and also education. So we work on both, I guess, online and offline solutions. My background is working in psychology. So psychologist by background, worked clinically within the NHS, and left because I came frustrated with, I guess, the lack of access around 10 ago that many people had to accessing therapeutic support. And so for about 10 years, I've been working to set up projects, programs, creating games offline and online to support people's well-being. And the one that I want to share with you today is Neuro Champions. And Neuro Champions was a program that we created around 4 to 5 years ago to support young people to learn about the brain through play. So I guess the question that I like to ask is, how many people in this virtual room learnt about the brain when you were at school? I guess feel free to type and put it in the chat, but many people didn't learn about their brain. We don't learn that much about us ourselves. And actually, until the age of 25, our brain is developing and growing quite a lot, and the frontal lobe, which is going to be more complex than what I'll describe, that is controlled with a lot of our emotions, it is the last to develop. So in specifically sort of like teenage years, a lot of the experiences that young people have in relation to their mood and emotions and their emotional development are perfectly normal. But sometimes they're pathologized and they're called mental health problems. And actually, there's not a lot of focus around teaching young people around how their brain's developing, mental health, and doing it in a fun way. And I guess often when people access support, it's at a point of crisis. It's at a point when they're feeling incredibly low, they've experienced a trauma, they're feeling anxious. And nobody relates mental health and learning about your brain with play. So that's what we wanted to do. We really wanted to bring the fun and joy in learning about yourself. And part of the reason for that is that, this is completely, I guess, out of the window with COVID now, but the one that flies around is that 1 in 4 people experience a mental health problem. But one of the key focus areas that we had is that 25% of these mental health problems start before the age. So what is being done to prevent these developing, and especially time now and an era now where we have a lot more screen time, we're spending a lot more time inside and indoors. How are we thinking about how games and digital tools are serving a beneficial and positive purpose for children and young people? So for anybody who doesn't work in mental health or is aware of mental health, the challenge that is set, I guess, is the fact that no one really focuses on prevention. No one focuses on early identification. A lot of focus is on the intervention. So it's at the point when there's a problem and when people develop mental health. And where there's a great opportunity for the application of games and thinking about games in a way that they can be used as either a clinical tool or a social tool. So if somebody's experiencing a specific specific health problem or might develop one at a later stage, how can you look to position games maybe in the same way that medication's positioned or therapy's positioned to be able to support children, young people? And usually the average wait for that support is about 10 years, which is ridiculous, but that coincides when thinking about when mental health problems develop, and usually it's in the early teenage years. So Neuro Champions, we set up about 4 years ago. We were supported by commissions from local authorities, the Wellcome Trust, and a few other partners to think about how we could create fun interactive programs and games for young people. And so I guess our lab focuses on thinking about how we can create programs that incorporate gamification, or we use games as a tool to start conversations or educate young people about mental health, with our key aims of reducing mental ill health, creating new solutions but also healthy young people, and increasing that wide range of support that can actually be available for children and young people as well. So for anybody thinking about, I guess, creating games, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, our combination. And, you know, we see it as you have like a clear educational component. And so there's an outcome that you want to achieve. Combine that with love. And people may think that's fluffy. But actually, I think sometimes what we're thinking of when we're creating games, that with a non-clinical purpose, we're thinking of how we can keep people interacting, keep it sticky. And part of keeping games sticky is to sometimes evoke anxiety in the player, because then if you're feeling a bit anxious, you want to find out what to do next, or you want to continue. And we've got to sometimes question, is the anxiety, do we want to evoke that emotion? Is that positive in the long term? And combining that education, love with play to focus on how young people can understand themselves more, how they can access support through game and through gameplay, and how they can deal with some experiences that we know that thing. And, you know, again, right now is the adjustments that we're all having to deal with because of COVID, and in the UK and other countries because of lockdown. So for us, we see play at the core. And so everything we want to do, play needs to be at the core, but there's an interface of different things. So you have the technology, you have the psychological education and the grounded and the evidence based around that. And, you know, there's still an increasing evidence base around the application of games within mental health.
Oh no, I was hoping that Naomi would be able to jump back in. I assume she's trying to kind of jump back into the session. Hopefully, hanging on for a couple minutes. It is buffering. I'm hoping that she will. I feel like everyone should do a drum roll in their homes. Yeah, I hope that she's able to return. If not, if you do have any questions for her and the work that she's doing, please drop them off in the chat, because I'm sure she'd be more than happy to answer them. Next up is James Cook, a lecturer who joined the Reed School of Music at Edinburgh University in 2017. He's interested in representation of early music on stage and screen, and his talk is about how soundscapes shape perceptions. The floor is all yours, James.
Thank you. Can you see and hear me?
Sure can.
Good. Excellent. Brilliant. Thank you. Right, I'll just quickly share my screen. Right. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I am hoping to talk a bit about soundscapes and history, and why I think the two of those things are important. A little bit about who I am. My perspective is coming from a range of different areas. I'm by trade a music historian. My doctorate was in 15th century liturgical music, so everyone is probably wondering what on earth I'm doing here. But my other research area, which I spend about half my life doing, is working on music, particularly in TV, film, and game is really my main focus. I also work a fair bit as a public historian, public sound historian, essentially doing things like audio guides for Edinburgh Castle, things like that. And I've also developed virtual reality experiences for heritage spaces, trying to do virtual reality reconstructions of past performances. So if any of you are around near Linlithgow, you can go and check one of those out in Linlithgow Palace when that reopens after COVID. So I want to start by talking a little bit about history and why I think history matters. Then I'll move on to sound, and then I'll bring the two together. So history is quite a powerful thing, I think. Is the way that we represent, in that you can use it to rationalize particular perspectives, essentially. So it's a way of kind of making things seem good or natural in ways that can be quite problematic. And we often see this used in particular by white supremacy, things like that, which attempt to justify worldviews as based on some sort of historical precedent. But it's not all bad. It's also one of the ways in which societies sort of create their own identities. It's how they recognize themselves. It's how they build communities. And for us as creatives as well, it provides a lot of the palette of recognized shorthands that we can use to try and tell stories quickly. So it's both a really useful thing and sometimes a really problematic thing. And I'm kind of interested in the way that those things intersect. So to take, for example, the recent video game Witcher 3, that you might say is not a historical document, but I would say it uses history as a way of telling its story in a really interesting way. So it's a fantasy game, and fantasy has a real problem at its heart, which is that for stories to be compelling, you need some kind of sense of jeopardy. And for a sense of jeopardy, you kind of need to know what the rules are. But fantasy is about creating new worlds, which have different rules. You don't want to waste a load of time on exposition because people will just play a different game. So what we tend to see in fantasy is this reference to history as a way of using shorthands to tell the story and to give you a sense of the culture and the narrative without having to spend too much time on it. So I'll invert here an area of the game world. It's got a very Renaissance-y feel. It's drawing from popular conceptions of what the Renaissance looks like. So you've got Renaissance clothing, you've got Renaissance architecture, and as I'll get to in a bit, Renaissance soundscape. And you might contrast that, for instance, with the Phelan Wasteland, which is also drawing on history and also drawing on forms of popular medievalism, but in a really different way. You've got peasants and mud huts with straw, and lots of death and violence and destruction. And again, a soundtrack that kind of brings that through. It's still drawing on history, but it's drawing on different popular conceptions of history to give you a sense of what to expect in that area. Skellige as a final example, it's drawing on what we call Northern medievalism, which is kind of a weird co-option of Celtic and Northern Scandinavian aspects. So we have their Vikings wearing kilts. And we also have lots of architecture which draws on that, and a soundscape which does that as well. And that helps us understand what we might expect in that area. This kind of medievalism often comes with associations of relative freedom for women, for instance. And we see exactly that in this area of the game world. So I think that's a really interesting way that these things draw on history. Of course, fantasy in itself just draws on history generally. I've always seen fantasy as a way of basically telling the medieval through a medieval worldview. It's drawing on things like Geoffrey of Monmouth. It's drawing on the bestiaries of the medieval period as well. So all of this creates a kind of interpretive framework, so you don't have to waste too much time setting up your stories. So yeah, that's the sort of creative aspect. What about the problematic aspect? Well, historians such as myself have, in the last few years, found ourselves being drawn into very problematic aspects of politics. Medievalism in particular has started to be co-opted an awful lot by the far right, and that's imagery, that's using sort of particular ways of telling history to try and promulgate particular popular ideas. You get the idea of the sort of Crusader knight becoming part of it. You get ideas brought from Northern medievalism, sort of Viking cultures. It's a hugely problematic area. And I think my discipline has been quite slow to respond to that. It's starting to do so now. And that is in itself causing issues. I've had colleagues in America who've had to have armed escorts on campus and things because they've tried to counter people who've used their work in problematic ways. So I'm going to come back to that in a bit and show some ways in which that intersects problematically with game sound. Speaking of game sound, why does sound matter? It's fairly ubiquitous across visual media, but I think the important thing is we often don't really realize it's there. None of us really stop to question the fact that when you're watching a film, there is apparently an orchestra somewhere doing stuff. It doesn't matter how realistic that film is meant to be. I don't walk around the streets followed by a 120-piece symphony orchestra, but it's there. We take it for granted and we sort of don't think about it. But sound and music carries a myriad associations, and most of these are unconscious. So I think it's quite important that we start to look at that and dissect that, because it's something which can have an impact on us in ways we're maybe not really considering. Going back to The Witcher 3 as an example, I think the way that soundscape is used in this is fascinating. I've written about it quite a lot, and it really is used as an integral part of world building. All the different areas have different soundscapes, and they all draw on different types of popular understandings about the sounds of the past. So Oxenfurt, for instance, it's a really sort of Renaissance, early Enlightenment area, and it's sort of meant to be pitting rationalism against irrationalism. And here we get Renaissance dance bands, we get much more Renaissance type music, we get actual concerts. And you could contrast that with the Vale and Wasteland, which is a much more sort of dark, dangerous area. And it draws again on medievalism in terms of its music, and it draws on a wide array of non-Western instruments, be that Eastern European or further east. It draws a lot on microtonal inflection, chromaticism, and these things are really effective, but they do also draw from Orientalism in quite problematic ways, and ways which have been really just taken up wholeheartedly into medievalism without much thought. So this is linked to the sort of colonialist idea that if you want to know what the sounds of Europe sounded like in the past, well, why don't you go to a developing country and listen to their music because it will be the same? It's obvious how that's problematic, but we see that kind of brought through in that this music of the past, this medieval music, we just borrow what used to be called world music as a way of showing that. So I think there's some problematic things there, as effective as that is in the score. Skellige 2, I've mentioned that this draws on Northern medievalism, ideals. We get Gaelic song in it, in Gaelic, which is a really interesting choice. We also have borrowed a lot of vocal technique from Celtic music, so it really does lean heavily on that. And we get female vocals, which kind of mixes with that idea of relative freedom for women in that form of medievalism. It's not just music that I'm talking about, though. There's lots of other things. We get Foley, we get vocal accent. And vocal accent, again, is something we don't tend to think so much about, but it's often a way of giving really quick character and cultural information. Again, thinking of fantasy, we often get innocent rustic peasantry with West Country accents. You might get rugged peasantry with Northern English accents. So think of the North in Game of Thrones, or most of the characters in the film Black Death. Perhaps the most obvious example is dwarves, who are pretty much always Scottish now. A lot of people pin that on Lord of the Rings and assume that the actor who played Gimli was Scottish. That's become the major cultural representation of a dwarf, and therefore it's gone on. I actually think we can probably trace it back to World of Warcraft in the late 90s. And the actor that plays Gimli is actually Welsh and speaks with a very, very RP English accent. So it's nothing at all to do with that. What it's more to do with is this idea, again, drawing on Northern medievalism, that we're taking understandings of Celticness and using that as a shorthand to explain characteristics of an entire fantasy people. This is extremely useful as a way of word marking things out quickly, but it can also help to reinforce and perpetuate stereotypes. So drawing things that we see as relating to fantasy dwarves, and maybe we're starting to understand that as actually what Scotland is like. Okay, final example here, bringing together some of these things that I've spoken about. I suppose I want to start this by saying I'm not blaming terrorist atrocities on the video game Age of Conan, but I think it's important to understand where some of these things intersect in problematic ways. Anders Breivik, who committed various terrorist atrocities in Norway a few years ago, was particularly interested in white nationalism, but also in fantasy medievalism, and especially northern medievalism, which he saw as a way of kind of representing his worldview. He was particularly interested in Age of Conan, Hyborian Adventures, and as part of what he called his self-radicalization, he listened a lot to the soundtrack, and particularly works by Helena Bergsla, which used lyrics in Old Norwegian from the Poetic Edda. So he played this game a lot, he listened to this music a lot, and spoke about it an awful lot in his manifesto. Obviously, the game designers, the composer, the musicians have distanced themselves from those views, as one would expect. And it's problematic if we can't celebrate aspects of Scandinavian culture without having that being thought of as some aspect of the far right. But there is a clear intersection there, which I think we need to understand and get to grips with. I can see this coming to the fore again relatively soon with a forthcoming game, Hellblade 2, which is using music by Heilung. Heilung are an interesting band. They've got some great tracks. However, a lot of their imagery, a lot of their music draws on similar ideas of northern medievalism, and their fan base, some of them have been accused of being neo-Nazis, and they have been accused recently of not doing enough to distance themselves from this. You see much the same imagery, of course, in Hellblade 2, which is, again, a very much northern medievalism-focused game. It's problematic if we can't celebrate aspects of Scandinavian culture, but it's also problematic if we don't understand that aspects of this are being co-opted by the far right. So I think there are lots of things to kind of work through there. What do we mean by all of this? Well, I suppose the main thing I want to take away is be aware that powerful associations can be drawn from representations of history. It's not all about fact, it's very much about interpretation and narrative. Also be aware of how powerful music and broader soundscape can be within this. But also, watch out for going blindly down the historical authenticity angle. A lot of my work has been on showing that we have parallel authenticities, that lots of things go on at once. So yes, you can try and be authentic to a period, but you've also got to think about authenticity to yourself, to the medium, to the genre, and indeed to the public conception of history. It doesn't matter if what you're doing is 100% accurate if everybody has no idea what that is, because it's not what they understand of history. Okay, I realise I've gone a minute over time, so I'm going to be quiet now. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, James. I really, in particular, enjoyed the point about, I don't have a band behind me. I was like, well, that's maybe something to work on after the pandemic.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much again. So our next speaker is coming to us, I believe, from a time zone where it is 5:30 a.m. So please give her an extra warm welcome. Erica Rosenthal is the Director of Research at the USC Annenberg Norman Lear Center. She'll be sharing her work exploring the visual representation of poverty in games and the impact on players. It's all yours.
Thank you, Shay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you at Pop Change. As Shay said, it's about 5:30 a.m. here in California, so please bear with me. At the Lear Center, we study the impact of entertainment and media on society, and our work is really defined by the idea that stories matter. Stories are powerful because they grab our attention, they evoke powerful emotions, and they help us to make sense of information. They're embedded in larger narratives, which are conveyed through pop culture. So today I'll be sharing findings from research we conducted on pop culture narratives of poverty. And I'm going to turn my video off to preserve the Wi-Fi, and I'll screen share. Give me a minute. All right, hopefully this is working. So we conducted what we call a cultural audit, which is a method of gaining a deeper understanding of priority audiences by understanding the pop culture narratives they consume. We used a mixed methods approach involving several different research activities. To learn more about the broader research, you can visit our website at the link below. I'm talking today about our analysis of video games, and I want to preface this by saying that I'm not a video games expert. My expertise is in the mechanisms that make media narratives particularly influential, but we worked with a video games expert on this research. Because of their massive reach, video games have the potential to shape attitudes and beliefs on a variety of social issues. This study looked at how cultural narratives of poverty and wealth are evident in popular video games. Not so much explicitly through characters or story. Relatively few popular games explicitly address poverty in this way. Rather, we examine the ways in which these narratives are implicit in the game structure or design. We conducted a qualitative analysis of the 50 best-selling video games of all time. While educational or social impact games can be effective at shifting attitudes and behavior, they don't have nearly the same reach as popular mainstream games. We also interviewed 5 game creators and designers about their creative processes and how they understand video games in relation to narratives of poverty. Ultimately, our goal was to identify ways in which advocates and game creators might collaborate to challenge flawed narratives about poverty. Across the 50 games, we looked for 6 meta-narratives of poverty, which were identified through previous research by Good Inc. Meritocracy narratives were particularly evident in game structures. And meritocracy, of course, is the idea that everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, and that with enough effort, anyone can achieve wealth. So our research revealed 4 key points about how narratives of poverty are implicitly or explicitly conveyed through games. First, game structures rely on artificial meritocratic systems to incentivize and reward players. Second, merit-based game designs guarantee success for the player, reinforcing the myth of meritocracy. Third, a game that simulates the unfairness of living in poverty, in which effort and ability are not always rewarded, would be rather frustrating and dispiriting to play. But despite the challenges, there are ways that games can challenge meritocratic narratives and illuminate the systemic barriers faced by people living in poverty. So I'll talk about each of these briefly in turn. Game structures rely on artificial meritocratic systems to incentivize and reward players. For one thing, games often use poverty as a catalyst or motivator for gameplay. In the Grand Theft Auto series, the protagonist starts as a small-time criminal. As the player succeeds, their protagonist is rewarded with better weapons, cars, and other possessions, which make the character more powerful. Poverty is represented as an individual situation to be escaped, rather than a social problem to be fixed. Second, games often encourage or incentivize greed through the accumulation of virtual materials. But unlike in the real world, gathering these in-game resources does not typically come at the expense of other players. Finally, real money has a role in game worlds. For example, free-to-play games initially have no cost to the player, but require the player to pay for additional gameplay. Pay-to-win games are those that sell in-game items that provide a competitive advantage for real money. So through these elements, games can perpetuate, commonly held beliefs about meritocracy. Merit-based game designs also guarantee success for the player, further reinforcing these meritocratic myths. Game designs ensure that the player has a chance to succeed. An axiom of game design is to make no first level too easy and no last level too hard. Game systems also give players control over challenges, such as the ability to customize the game's difficulty level. So FIFA Soccer, for example, offers 6 levels of difficulty that control the opposing team's speed and ability. But in games, failure isn't a permanent state. The player's ability to restart a game minimizes the consequences of any mistakes that they make. So this creates an illusion of meritocracy. Games allow players to sidestep barriers by providing a safety net that in real life only exists for the wealthy. But a game simulating the unfairness of poverty would be pretty frustrating to play. The reward structure of video games is to produce an enjoyable experience, not necessarily to mimic real-world challenges. And developers fine-tune their games to provide just enough challenge to foster a sense of mastery, but not so much to make gameplay discouraging. One of our interviewees, Nick Fortunio of Playmatics, designed the educational game Haiti to simulate the experience of an impoverished family in Haiti. In the game, one of the items for purchase is a house, but there's no way the player can actually make enough money to buy the house. Fortunio said, "I wanted the game design to model despair." Despair generally doesn't make for an enjoyable or profitable game experience, but this game was never actually intended for recreation. Ron Grill of Game Tapas noted that in order to be effective, a game must fundamentally be fun. If gameplay does not engage, the theme is lost. But games do have the potential to challenge meritocratic narratives. So here's some recommendations for game creators that emerged from our research. First, present the challenge directly to players. For example, Minecraft collaborated with the United Nations on Block by Block, a program that used the game to help global communities envision neighborhood improvement projects. Second, modify existing gameplay by making poverty a game mode. Minecraft gives players the option to play in survival mode, which challenges them to build shelter and survive enemy attacks with limited resources. So this type of mode could be modified to randomly give some players more difficult obstacles or fewer resources at the outset of the game, simulating more of a non-meritocratic system. Third, in-game avatars that are struggling financially could enable players to identify and empathize with real people in poverty. And finally, build some element of failure or unfairness into the game experience, not so much to make it frustrating to play. Games like Tetris that eventually overwhelm the player do to some extent mimic the challenge of escaping poverty. Hal Milton of Pipeworks Software believes this approach could negate the need for explicit stories about poverty in games. He noted, "Nobody says being poor is bad in The Grapes of Wrath." And indeed, our research and that of others have shown that heavy-handed social issue messages in entertainment can sometimes backfire. Communicating about poverty and other social issues through games requires balancing story and structure. Advocates should consider the following strategies. First, partner with an existing successful game franchise, which will have a wealth of experience and best practices. Larger publishers may also be better able to dedicate resources to game development. Second, avoid reinventing the wheel and build on existing gameplay systems and structures. Most new games build upon systems that are already known to engage audiences. Third, tie social issue narratives into an already popular game. It's easier to partner with an existing game community than to build a new community from scratch. And finally, get the right people in the room. This includes experienced game developers, subject matter experts, members of the community being represented, as well as influencers who can share the game with a larger audience. I'd like to thank Michael Ahn of Golden Bough Strategies, who led this research, and the Norman Lear Center's research team, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which supported this research. If you'd like to read our reports on video games and the rest of our poverty research, you can head over to mediaimpactproject.org/poverty. Thank you to Pop Change for having me, and thank you all for your time. So I'll be in the lounge this afternoon your time, and I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much for that, Erica. You've actually made me think about a lot of how I engage with games myself, things like Animal Crossing, where I spend a lot of my time mining for turnips, and then in turn flipped it into millions and millions of bells. So you've got me thinking about the ways that I will engage with poverty in gaming. So thank you so much. I think there will be the opportunity to ask questions. So please do look around in the chat and answer those, Erica. Again, thank you so much for your time and being up at this incredibly early hour. So once again, I just want to thank each and every one of our incredible speakers. As it was previously mentioned, games have come a really long way in terms of the stories that they tell, the teams behind them, and the people that they reached. As promised earlier, I hope you've gained more insight into the world of gaming and even more knowledge, because I know that I have, as someone who is, frequently immersed in this world. I know I've learned a lot, and it's causing me to kind of check myself and, reassess the way that I approach gaming. As mentioned earlier, we've got a full afternoon of workshops, another panel, I believe, and some networking opportunities, so please stick around. The workshops in particular are activating real-world impact with Us2 Games and the UN, writing diverse voices and lived experiences into game narratives with Corey Brotherson, writer for Silver Ring Games, and using games to inoculate against fake news with John Rosenbeck of the University of Cambridge. As mentioned as well, there is August Aidan Black, who is the voice of Tyler Ronan from Tell Me Why, will also be conducting a workshop. It's still happening. I don't break my promises. And that's all from me. I have thoroughly enjoyed hosting this early afternoon and this morning's festivities. Thank you so much for having me and bearing with me. I've had a blast. That's it from me. So take care, everybody. Have a good